The sun was just beginning to set over the vast, rolling hills of the Wyoming countryside. The wind rustled through the tall grasses, carrying with it the earthy scent of a coming storm. It was a peaceful evening, but one that would mark the beginning of a tale that would ripple through the region, one of danger, courage, and an unexpected hero. Baxter, a large German shepherd with a dark, shaggy coat, was sitting at the edge of the ranch, eyes keenly watching the herds of sheep below. He had been the loyal companion of the Thompson family for 5 years, working alongside his master, Dean Thompson, a rugged man known for his strength and resilience. But Baxter was no ordinary sheepdog. He was a soldier, born for the field, with an instinct to protect and a heart full of loyalty. Dean trusted Baxter more than anyone else. Over the years, Baxter had protected the flock from wolves, managed the sheep with a precision no human could match, and always followed Dean's commands without question. But tonight, something felt different. As the darkness began to settle, Baxter's instincts were on high alert. His ears perked up, his eyes narrowed. Something was out there, lurking in the distance. Welcome to the HeartForce channel, where you and I find more meaning in life through dog stories. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you are listening to this video. And if you have any dog stories of your own, feel free to share them with everyone. Baxter stood and trotted toward the corral where Dean was securing the gate. "What's got you so worked up, boy?" Dean asked, his voice low and calm, though even he could sense the tension in the air. Baxter whined, pacing back and forth, looking at Dean and then back to the hills where the shadows seemed to dance unnaturally. Dean knew his dog. When Baxter was this unsettled, danger was near. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the evening silence. It wasn't a normal cry. Dean's eyes widened. It was the unmistakable sound of a sheep being attacked. The cry came from the farthest corner of the pasture, near the old barn, where the sheep were most vulnerable to predators. Without hesitation, Baxter was already sprinting towards the sound, his strong legs eating up the ground beneath him. Dean grabbed his rifle and followed, but he knew Baxter would reach the scene first. The dog was faster, more attuned to the land than any human could ever be. As Baxter neared the barn, he skidded to a halt, his body low to the ground. A pack of wolves, at least 5, had cornered young Yu. The sight of the wolves, their eyes gleaming with hunger, sent a chill down Baxter's spine. The pack had been bolder lately, coming closer to the ranch as food sources in the wild grew scarcer. They had to be stopped, or the herd would be decimated. Baxter didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his teeth bared in a snarl, tackling the nearest wolf with a force that sent it tumbling to the ground. The rest of the pack turned, snarling, preparing to fight. But Baxter was ready. He was a warrior, not just a sheepdog. His years of protecting the herd had honed his instincts into a finely tuned weapon. One by one, Baxter fought off the wolves, using his powerful jaws to incapacitate them. The sound of growls and the thud of paws on dirt echoed in the air as the battle raged on. Baxter was relentless. He refused to let the pack harm his flock. Dean arrived just in time to see the last wolf retreat, limping away with a deep wound on its side. Baxter stood tall, panting heavily, his fur matted with dirt and blood, but his eyes fierce and determined. The young Yu, now safe, stood beside him, looking up at him with gratitude in her innocent eyes. Dean couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for his dog. "You saved them, didn't you, boy?" he murmured, rubbing Baxter's head. Baxter's tail wagged, but his eyes remained sharp, still scanning the surroundings. The battle may have been over, but something told him the danger was far from gone. The storm on the horizon wasn't just a weather front. It was a warning. And Baxter would be ready. As Dean led Baxter back to the barn, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. He knew this was only the beginning. The wolves were growing bolder, and worse threats might be on the horizon. And then, as they reached the barn, Dean saw something that made his heart stop. In the distance, beyond the horizon, a dark figure moved, too large to be a person, too fast to be an animal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong on this land. Baxter growled low, sensing the presence before Dean even saw it. The real battle was about to begin. The storm clouds that had been gathering all evening finally burst open. Rain began to fall in sheets, driven by a fierce wind that rattled the windows of the old farmhouse. Inside, the warm glow of the hearth seemed to offer no comfort as the wind howled through the cracks of the walls. Dean sat at the kitchen table, staring at the darkened world outside, his mind racing. Baxter, ever watchful, lay by the door, his head turned towards the same horizon that Dean couldn't stop gazing at. Something wasn't right. Dean tried to push the unease from his mind, but the image of the dark figure he had glimpsed earlier lingered. It had been tall, moving with unnatural speed, its silhouette unlike anything Dean had ever seen. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a predator. It was something more, something far more dangerous. The wolves were a constant threat, but this was different. It was a warning. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" Dean muttered, his voice hoarse. Baxter raised his head, his ears perked, and then returned to his alert posture. He was focused, as if listening to something only he could hear. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the roof with a relentless force. Outside, the sheep huddled together in the barn, seeking shelter from a storm. Dean had checked on them, but his mind kept drifting back to that figure in the distance. The same instinct that had driven him to join the army years ago, the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless battles, was telling him that the storm was only a prelude to something much worse. The night seemed endless. The wind continued to howl, and every so often, a flash of lightning would light up the sky, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. As the hours passed, Dean found himself standing by the window again, staring out into the dark. Baxter stood beside him, his stance rigid, his tail stiff. Dean watched the dog's every move, knowing that when Baxter was this focused, danger was never far behind. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the storm, the unmistakable howl of a wolf. But this was different. It was not the call of a lone wolf. It was a chorus, a cry from the pack, and it was closer than before. Dean's heart raced. He grabbed his rifle and made his way to the door, his boots crunching on the wet dirt. Baxter was already ahead of him, charging out into the rain with his usual determination. Dean followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the landscape, every part of him on high alert. The night was alive with the sounds of the storm, but beneath it, there was something more, a heavy silence, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They reached the barn, and Dean's hand tightened around the rifle. There, at the edge of the field, he saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't a shadow. It was real, standing tall and motionless. Its form was almost human, but it was too large, too unnatural. Dean couldn't make out its features, but he could feel its presence, cold and menacing, like a storm that wasn't made of rain, but of pure malevolence. Baxter growled low, his hackles raised. He was tense, poised for action. Dean's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to the figure. He felt an icy shiver run down his spine, but there was no turning back. The figure suddenly moved. It wasn't the slow, deliberate movement of a human or even an animal. It was unnatural, fast, as if it was gliding rather than walking. It moved towards the barn, its form flickering in the darkness as though it wasn't entirely bound by the physical world. Dean's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He lifted his rifle, aiming carefully at the figure. But before he could pull the trigger, a blinding flash of lightning lit up the night sky, and in that instant, the figure disappeared. The storm raged around them, the wind howling as though it were angry. Baxter barked twice, his voice sharp and commanding, but there was no sign of the figure anymore. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "What in the world?" Dean whispered, lowering his rifle. His eyes were wide with confusion and disbelief. He looked down at Baxter, whose eyes were still locked on the spot where the figure had stood moments before. The dog's growl had softened, but it was still there, a low rumble deep in his chest. The storm didn't seem to relent, and for the first time that night, Dean felt a deep sense of dread seep into his bones. It wasn't the wolves that scared him now. It was whatever that figure was, and it was still out there, watching. As the rain began to subside and the storm seemed to pass, Dean and Baxter returned to the farmhouse. Dean's mind raced with questions. What had he seen? And why had it disappeared? But no answers came. Back inside, Dean poured himself a drink, the warmth of the whiskey doing little to settle the unease in his stomach. Baxter sat at his feet, his eyes still on the door, as though expecting the figure to return at any moment. Dean leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He had faced enemies before, both on the battlefield and in his life as a rancher. But this was something new, something far darker than he had ever encountered. Whatever it was, it's not over, Dean muttered, and we have to be ready for whatever comes next. The storm had passed, but the danger was far from over. The morning sun was sluggish, rising behind dark clouds still lingering from the night storm. The air was thick with humidity, and the world around Dean seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The ranch, usually full of life and motion, felt eerily quiet. Dean stood on the porch of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the wide expanse of his land. The ground was still slick with rain, and the scent of wet earth and damp foliage hung heavily in the air. His mind, however, was far from peaceful. The dark figure, the wolves, and the deep sense of danger still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the wolves that worried him now. It was the ominous presence he'd felt the night before, that thing he couldn't quite understand. Beside him, Baxter sat as usual, stoic, alert, always the watchful protector. But even the dog seemed off this morning. He was restless, shifting from paw to paw, his gaze darting toward the horizon, as if he, too, felt the weight of an impending storm. Dean rubbed his hand over his face, feeling the stubble scrape his palm. "What's out there, boy?" he muttered, his voice low. Baxter's ears twitched in response, but he didn't answer. Before Dean could dwell too much on his thoughts, a sharp, panic cry echoed across the field. A sheep, and then another. The unmistakable sound of distress. Dean didn't think. He was already running, his boots slapping against the wet earth as Baxter bolted ahead of him, his body low to the ground, tail stiff with purpose. The wind had picked up again, carrying the sounds of chaos across the ranch. Dean's heart pounded, and without hesitation, he grabbed his rifle and followed the dog, trusting Baxter would find the danger before he did. The pasture was a frenzy of bleating sheep, their hooves pounding against the ground as they scattered in all directions. Dean saw immediately, there in the center of the flock, a pack of wolves, their eyes glowing with hunger, their forms sleek and predatory. But these weren't just any wolves. These were massive, more muscular, their teeth longer and sharper than any wolves Dean had ever seen. Baxter was already in the thick of it. His powerful form tore through the chaos, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl. Dean's heart swelled with pride as he watched the dog take on the pack. But there were too many wolves. Baxter could fight them off, but there were always more. Dean raised his rifle and fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the open field. One of the wolves dropped, but it barely slowed the others. They kept advancing, circling the flock, pushing forward with a terrifying unity. They weren't just predators. They were a force, a coordinated strike meant to overwhelm. Baxter darted between the wolves, faster than they could react, his jaws snapping at the nearest wolf's throat. With a sharp yelp, the wolf stumbled backward, but Baxter was relentless. He didn't hesitate. He kept pushing forward, fending off the pack with everything he had. Dean fired again, taking down another wolf. But in the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The dark figure, standing at the far edge of the field, tall and shadowed, watching. It didn't move, not at first, just watched the battle unfold. Dean's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but he couldn't take his eyes off the figure. It was watching, waiting, and then the figure moved. In a blur of speed and unnatural grace, it glided toward the battle, its form becoming more tangible with every step. The wolves, as if sensing its presence, grew bolder, more vicious. It was clear the figure was leading them. The wolves were no longer acting on instinct alone. This was something else, something far darker. Baxter was still in the thick of the fight, tackling wolves, biting down on their necks with precision and tearing them away from the herd. But there was only so much one dog could do against an entire pack. Dean's heart raced as he tried to calculate his next move, but his thoughts were interrupted by a deafening howl, the call of the pack, signaling that they were no longer just fighting for food. This was a hunt led by something that wasn't of this world. "Baxter!" Dean shouted, but his voice was lost in the wind. The dog's ears flicked, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His instincts were too strong. The pack, sensing a shift, began to turn toward the herd again. Dean took a deep breath, pushing the panic down. He had no choice but to follow. He ran toward the wolves, firing another shot as one of them lunged at the nearest sheep. But the shot missed its mark. The wolves were too fast, too coordinated. It was then that Dean realized the truth. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't just controlling the wolves. It was manipulating them, commanding them. And now, it had set its sights on the herd. In a final act of desperation, Dean took aim once more. This time, he wasn't targeting the wolves. His aim was set squarely on the figure. But before he could pull the trigger, Baxter, with a ferocity that surprised even Dean, leapt at the figure from behind. His body slammed into the dark figure with a force that sent it stumbling. The figure shrieked, an unnatural, terrifying sound that froze the very air around them. Dean could barely comprehend what he saw. The figure wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way he understood. It was like a shadow, a creature made of darkness. And for a moment, Dean wondered if it was something born from the storm itself. Baxter, undeterred by the figure's eerie presence, lunged again, this time connecting with the creature. The dark figure faltered, but it wasn't defeated. Instead, it twisted, its form distorting, becoming something more monstrous. The wolves stopped their attack. They circled the figure, as though waiting for its command. "Baxter!" Dean cried again, his voice ragged, desperate. But before he could reach the dog, the figure turned toward him. Its eyes were hollow, endless pits that seemed to draw on the light. The air grew colder, and for a moment, Dean felt the weight of all his fears crashing down on him. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The wolves, too, dispersed, retreating back into the darkness from which they had come. The field fell silent, save for the wind and the distant sound of rain. Baxter, bloodied but unharmed, stood alone in the middle of the field, his chest heaving. Dean rushed to his side, his heart hammering in his chest. But the dog didn't need his help. Baxter stood tall, his eyes still locked on the spot where the figure had been moments before. Dean didn't speak. He didn't need to. He understood now. This wasn't just a battle for the herd. This was something deeper, something that had been unleashed by forces beyond their understanding. And whatever it wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The aftermath of the battle was surreal, like waking from a nightmare into a world that had shifted just slightly out of focus. The clouds overhead had darkened again, not with the promise of rain, but with something far more oppressive. The quiet of the pasture was unsettling, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something more to come. Dean stood beside Baxter, his heart still racing, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The wolves had retreated, and with them, the dark figure that had appeared so suddenly, commanding them like a puppet master. Baxter's fur was matted with blood, some his own, some from the wolves. His body was tense, every muscle coiled and ready, his eyes still flicking to the horizon, wary, vigilant. The dog hadn't relaxed since the figure had vanished, and neither had Dean. "Is it over, boy?" Dean asked, but the question was rhetorical. He already knew the answer. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They stood in the middle of the field, surrounded by the chaos of the battle. Dispersed sheep, fallen wolves, and the faint smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. The ranch, normally a sanctuary for Dean and his family, had turned into something unrecognizable, something out of a nightmare. Dean's eyes darted to the dark hills in the distance, where the figure had stood moments ago. The same eerie stillness had returned to the landscape, but there was no comfort in it. Something was wrong, something deep in the earth, in the air. The land was no longer peaceful. It had been violated, tainted, and Dean knew in his gut that whatever force had come upon them, it was far from finished. "Come on, Baxter," Dean murmured, his voice tight. "Let's check the herd." They moved slowly, cautiously, past the scattered sheep who were now huddling together in the farthest corner of the pasture. The animals were spooked, their eyes wide with fear. Baxter moved with purpose, herding them back into the barn with practiced precision. Dean stood by the barn's entrance, watching, his mind racing through possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had all been too orchestrated, too controlled. The wolves hadn't attacked just for food. And that figure, it hadn't been just another predator. It was a force of something darker, something intentional. "Dean," a voice called out from behind him. He turned to find his brother, Nate, approaching on horseback. His face was drawn with worry. "Not a good sight, huh?" Nate said, glancing at the battlefield around them. Dean nodded grimly. "Wolves are bad enough, but this," he shook his head. "It's like something was pulling their strings. I've never seen wolves act like that before." Nate frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's some kind of coordinated attack? Or something unnatural?" Dean didn't have an answer, and the truth was, he didn't want to believe what his gut was telling him. But after what he'd witnessed, he couldn't deny it any longer. "The worst part is," Dean said quietly, "I think it's just getting started." As they talked, Baxter finished herding the last of the sheep into the barn, his movements smooth and effortless. But there was something off about the dog's posture. His hackles remained raised, and he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the distant hills, as though expecting something, someone, to appear. Dean had never seen his dog like this before. Baxter was a protector, a fighter, but now he seemed to be sensing something beyond what was visible. Dean clapped his hands, snapping his focus back to the present. "We need to get these sheep safe and get ready. I don't think this is just about us anymore. There's something going on out here, something bigger than wolves." Nate nodded and dismounted from his horse. "What do we do now?" Dean's gaze swept over the ranch. The house, the barn, the fields, they all seemed so normal. But beneath that, something was wrong. Something deep. He turned back to his brother. "We keep watch. We don't go out alone. We protect the herd, and we prepare for whatever's coming next." Nate seemed ready to argue, but then he looked over at Baxter. The dog was still staring toward the horizon, his eyes unwavering. Nate could see it too. "We're not going to have a choice, are we?" he said softly. Dean didn't respond. He knew what his brother was asking. No, they wouldn't have a choice. Whatever it was coming for them. That night, the wind picked up again, howling through the cracks in the barn. Dean couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside, made him more alert. Baxter remained at his side, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the dark beyond. Dean lay awake in the dark, trying to quiet his mind. His thoughts kept returning to the figure, so strange, so wrong, and the wolves that had followed it. It was as if they were being drawn into something larger than themselves, something with an agenda. In the early hours of the morning, just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Dean heard a sound that froze him in place, a low, ominous growl. He opened his eyes, heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. It was coming from outside the window, from beyond the barn. He slowly sat up, reaching for the rifle he had kept by his side. The growl echoed again, and this time Baxter stood and padded to the door, his body tense and alert. Dean followed, his hand tightening around the rifle's grip. They stepped outside, the chill of early morning cutting through the air. The world was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the ranch, birds, rustling leaves, the distant hum of nature, were gone. There was only the growl, a low rumble that vibrated the very ground beneath their feet. Dean's eyes searched the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source. Baxter was already moving toward the pasture, his eyes scanning the night. The dog's growl deepened, and Dean's gut twisted. And then, just as they reached the edge of the field, they saw it. There, in the moonlight, standing tall in the distance, was the figure again. Dean's heart skipped a beat. This time, it wasn't a shadow. It was real, and it wasn't alone. Dozens of wolves were gathered around it, watching, waiting. It was as if the very land itself had become their domain. The pack had returned, But this time, they were not just a threat to the herd. They were part of something far more sinister. And this time, Dean knew there was no running from it. The darkness of the field stretched endlessly before Dean, but now it was pierced by the moonlight, casting an eerie, silvery glow over the wolves and the figure that stood among them. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, real, and it was commanding the pack. The wolves, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, surrounded the figure in a perfect, impenetrable circle. Dean's pulse quickened, his grip tightening on the rifle. Baxter, beside him, stood stock still, his body tense, his eyes locked on the figure. The growl that had been rumbling in his throat deepened. But it wasn't fear in the dog's eyes, it was defiance. Baxter wasn't about to back down. Dean wasn't about to either. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The wind had died, the night air thick with anticipation. There was no sound except the distant howling of the wolves and the deep, unnatural growls that came from their throats. The tension in the air was suffocating. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the battle that was about to unfold. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. Dean's breath caught his throat. The creature was tall, almost impossibly so, and cloaked in shadow. Its eyes gleamed, hollow and dark, like black pits that drew in the light around them. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't human. This wasn't even an animal. It was something far older, far darker, and it had come for something. Dean's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure step toward him. It moved with a grace that didn't belong in the natural world. Every step was deliberate, calculated, and with each move, the pack of wolves shifted with it, their eyes focused on Dean and Baxter like soldiers ready for battle. "Stay close, Baxter," Dean whispered under his breath. The German shepherd didn't need telling twice. His posture was that of a warrior, ready for anything, but still, there was a wariness in his eyes, an understanding that this wasn't just another battle. The creature stopped a few yards from them, standing tall and unyielding. The wolves, silent now, circled behind it like a living, breathing wall of predators. Their eyes never left Baxter and Dean. The whole scene was like something out of a nightmare that had now become all too real. Dean's mind raced. There was no doubt now. The figure was orchestrating the wolves, controlling them with a dark power that no human could fathom. But why? What did it want with his land? With his herd? The figure lifted one hand, its fingers long and skeletal, pointing directly at Baxter. Dean felt a chill run down his spine. The moment the figure raised its hand, the wolves began to advance, their growls low and threatening. Their movements were calculated, their eyes never leaving the dog. Dean's grip on the rifle tightened. "No," he muttered under his breath. "Not this time." With a sudden, sharp movement, he raised the rifle and fired. The shot rang out through the night, echoing across the field. The wolf at the front of the pack dropped to the ground, its body crumpling with a finality that felt like a warning. But the figure didn't flinch. It didn't even react. The wolves, however, seemed to pause. Their eyes flicked to the fallen wolf and then back to Dean, as if waiting for a command. But the figure remained unmoved, its cold, dark eyes locked on the dog, on Baxter. The tension in the air grew unbearable. Dean's breath was shallow, his pulse racing. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stop now. They couldn't back down. He wasn't going to let this creature, this dark force, take anything from him. Not his land, not his herd, and certainly not his dog. With a low, guttural bark, Baxter lunged forward, his teeth bared. The wolves, sensing the challenge, charged as well. Dean followed behind, rifle raised, determined to hold his ground. The battle was chaotic. Baxter fought with a strength and ferocity that stunned even Dean. He had seen the dog fight off wolves before, but this was something different. Baxter's movements were faster, more fluid, like he was more than just a dog. He was something else, something born for this fight. Dean fired again, taking down 2 more wolves, but there were always more. The pack seemed endless, and for every wolf that fell, another took its place. The dark figure stood unmoving, as if watching a game it controlled, a twisted spectator enjoying the chaos. Baxter was in the thick of it, leaping and snapping at the wolves with a precision that no animal could match. His growls filled the air, the sound of a warrior fighting for his life and for those he loved. Dean fired again, but his shots were becoming less accurate, less focused. The wolves were closing in on him now, the figure's dark presence growing stronger, heavier. And then, just when Dean thought they were about to be overwhelmed, Baxter made a move that stopped everything. With a ferocious bark, the German shepherd lunged at the dark figure, his body colliding with the shadow like a force of nature. The figure stumbled back, its eyes flashing with an eerie light. It was no longer calm, no longer in control. The wolves hesitated, confused by the sudden shift in the balance of power. The figure recoiled, its dark form flickering, like it was unsure what to do next. In that moment, Dean took his chance. He raised his rifle and aimed directly at the creature's chest. There was no hesitation, no more fear. With one final, desperate pull of the trigger, he fired. The shot rang out, the sound deafening. The figure shrieked, an unnatural, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Dean's spine. The wolves howled in unison, their cries filled with panic as they scattered into the night, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. Dean's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure disintegrate before his eyes, its form dissolving into nothingness, like smoke fading into the wind. The last of the wolves retreated, and for a moment there was nothing but the echo of their retreating footsteps. Baxter stood at Dean's side, panting heavily, his eyes still scanning the horizon, alert and watchful. The dog's body was bloodied, but he was alive. They had survived. Dean lowered his rifle, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. He turned to Baxter, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. "We did it, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We did it." The storm had passed. The darkness had been driven away. For now. But Dean knew that the land had been changed. The figure, whatever it was, had left its mark on them. And he knew, deep in his bones, that this battle was far from over. The darkness wasn't gone. It had merely retreated for the time being. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, Dean stood tall, his dog by his side. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. The days that followed the battle felt like a strange sort of peace had descended upon the ranch. The wounds from the night were healing, both physical and emotional. The sheep, though still skittish, were safe. Dean worked alongside Baxter, returning to the familiar tasks of running the ranch. But something was different. The land felt unsettled. The wind carried whispers that only the land seemed to understand. And each time Dean glanced at the horizon, he could swear the shadows moved just a little bit differently, a little more unnaturally. The storm had passed, but the darkness lingered, clinging to the air like smoke that refuses to clear. Baxter was ever watchful. The German shepherd no longer bounded freely through the fields with the same joy he once had. He stayed closer to Dean, his eyes always scanning the horizon, his senses alert to any change in the environment. Dean couldn't blame him. He felt it too. It was early morning when it happened again. Dean was out checking the perimeter of the ranch, his boots crunching on the dew-covered grass. Baxter was by his side, as usual, nose to the ground, sniffing for any signs of trouble. They had passed the southern pasture and were heading toward the old barn when Baxter suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Dean followed the dog's gaze, his stomach tightening. There, at the edge of the pasture, standing just beyond the trees, was the figure. It wasn't quite as solid as the last time, more like a faint shadow flickering in and out of existence, as if it were struggling to hold its form. The figure moved, but slowly, and with an unsettling calm. There was no mistaking it now. The creature had returned, and it was biding its time. Dean's heart pounded. He was no longer afraid of the creature's power. What terrified him was its persistence. It was still here, still watching, still waiting for something. Something that Dean didn't yet understand. "Baxter, stay," Dean whispered, though he knew his dog wouldn't need the command. The German shepherd's eyes never left the figure. his posture rigid and alert. Dean slowly crouched down, reaching for the rifle that he always carried with him now. The cold metal of the gun felt foreign in his hands, but it was a weapon, and it was all he had. The figure didn't move. It stood, waiting. Dean's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The wolves, the strange behavior, the way the creature had controlled them all. It wasn't a simple predator. It wasn't a random attack. There was something deeper at play here, something tied to the land, to the ranch, something ancient. And the thought hit him like a bolt of lightning. The ranch. This ranch had been in his family for generations. His ancestors had worked the land long before Dean had ever set foot on it. What if somehow this creature, this dark force, was tied to the land itself, to something that had been buried here long before Dean or his family had ever arrived? Baxter gave a low growl, breaking Dean's thoughts. The dog's eyes were locked on the figure, but he hadn't moved an inch. The creature took a step forward. Dean's heart skipped a beat. The wolf pack hadn't been a random act. The creature was drawing something out, something specific. The wolves were merely tools. And now, the figure was moving again. It was coming closer. Dean's finger hovered over the rifle's trigger, but then, the figure suddenly stopped. It flickered again, as if wavering between two worlds, its dark form seemingly pulled by an unseen force. Then, for a moment, Dean saw it. Its eyes, hollow, empty pits like two black voids staring directly at him. He felt the weight of those eyes. It was as though the creature was seeing into his very soul, reading his every fear and thought. It wasn't just a battle for survival. It wasn't just about the ranch or the wolves. It was about Dean. It was about him, about his very essence, and the creature knew it. In the distance, a sudden movement caught Dean's eye. A small group of sheep had wandered from the barn, making their way toward the pasture. Dean's pulse quickened. He could sense it. This was what the creature had been waiting for. It wasn't just a random attack. It was orchestrated. It had to be. The creature stepped forward again, this time much closer. Its form was flickering faster, becoming more defined. The shadows that surrounded it seemed to stretch longer, like tendrils reaching toward the earth. Dean's grip tightened around the rifle. But before he could act, Baxter surged forward with a growl. Without thinking, Dean followed, his feet pounding the dirt as they both raced toward the sheep. The moment the figure saw them moving, it lunged. Time seemed to slow as Baxter leaped at the creature, his powerful body colliding with it in an explosion of fury. The figure twisted, its form warping and distorting under the weight of the dog's attack. Dean barely had time to raise his rifle. With a cry, he fired, the bullet striking the creature with a sickening crack. But it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. The creature's form seemed to pulse, like it was feeding off the attack. It twisted, rippling in a wave of darkness before it snapped back at Baxter, its dark limbs moving faster than the eye could track. The German shepherd yelped in pain as the creature's grasp took hold of him, its shadowy arms coiling around Baxter's body. "No!" Dean screamed, rushing forward, his rifle forgotten. He grabbed the creature's arm and pulled, but it was like trying to pull against a shadow. The creature's form was too fluid, too powerful. Baxter's body stiffened in the grasp of the creature, but his eyes were fierce, full of defiance, even in the face of death. Dean's heart slammed in his chest, but he didn't back down. He had to save his dog, had to stop whatever this was. The creature's eyes glowed with that same hollow darkness, and in that moment, Dean realized the truth. It wasn't just here for the land. It was here for Baxter, for the bond between man and dog. It wanted to sever that connection, to break their bond, and with it, Dean's strength. Then, just as Dean felt like he might lose his grip, he heard a voice, a familiar voice, one he hadn't expected to hear. Let go of him. It wasn't a voice from the land. It wasn't even his own. It was his father's voice. Dean froze, looking over his shoulder, but saw no one. The voice echoed in his mind, and in that moment he understood. His father, who had passed away years ago, had always been a protector of this land. He had fought for it, just as Dean had. The voice, that presence, it was part of the ranch, part of what made it sacred, and it was giving Dean the strength he needed. Dean's hand found a stone, cold and ancient, at the base of the field. He slammed it against the creature's form with all his might. The impact shook the very ground, and with an ear-splitting roar, the creature's form exploded into a cloud of darkness, dissipating into the wind. Baxter fell to the ground, his body trembling but alive. Dean rushed to his side, pulling him close. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Dean whispered, "We made it, boy. We made it." But as he looked out across the field, Dean knew that this victory was only temporary. The darkness wasn't gone. It had merely retreated, and he knew it would return. And next time, they would be ready. The days following the battle were quieter, though the silence was not without weight. Dean and Baxter returned to their routines, but the land had changed. It was as if something deep within it had been stirred, a long-forgotten power that would never fully rest. The figure, the wolves, and the darkness were all part of a battle that Dean couldn't fully understand, but now it had left them, at least for the moment. Dean stood on the porch of the farmhouse one evening, watching as the last light of day stretched across the land. The ranch, his family's legacy, stood peaceful in the fading sunlight. It was still his home, still his sanctuary, but the feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow that couldn't quite be cast off. The battle had left its mark, both on the land and on him. Baxter sat beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon as he always did now, ever watchful, ever alert. The dog was no longer the carefree animal he once was, but his loyalty had only grown. Dean smiled softly at the dog. He had been his protector, his companion, and through it all, his unshakable source of strength. They had fought together, and now, in the quiet of the evening, they could rest. The battle with the creature had been one of survival, but it was also one of growth, both for Dean and for the land. The darkness that had come to them was ancient, a force of nature that had been disturbed by something Dean didn't fully understand. But whatever it had been defeated, at least for now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dean felt a shift in the air. The wind, which had been still for days, suddenly picked up, carrying with it the scent of the earth, fresh and new. It was as though the land was taking a deep breath after the storm, ready to move forward. The earth had been tested, but it had not broken. The trees, the grass, and the sheep, the life on the ranch, was still here, still thriving. Dean turned to Baxter, who was still watching the distance. "We got a long way to go, haven't we, boy?" Baxter's tail flicked slightly, but he didn't take his eyes off the horizon. Dean knew that they couldn't ever be fully sure the darkness was gone. The creature had been powerful, and it had come from somewhere deep within the earth. But he also knew that they had faced it together. They had fought for the land, for the animals, for each other, and they had won. It wasn't just the land they were protecting anymore. It was each other, and no force, whether dark or unknown, could ever change that. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Dean felt something shift within him. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty that had plagued him for so long, it was gone. In its place, there was a quiet strength, a peace that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a protector, a keeper of something sacred. And as he looked out at the peaceful, moonlit landscape, he knew that whatever came next, whatever threats the future might hold, he and Baxter would face them together. The land was theirs, and they would defend it for as long as they had breath in their bodies. Baxter stood, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, a soft growl in his throat. Dean followed his gaze. In the distance, the first light of dawn was breaking over the hills. It was a new day, a day of hope, a day of healing. And this time, Dean wasn't afraid. The darkness had come and gone. But now, the light would return. The sun had risen on the ranch, casting its golden glow over the landscape. The early morning light filtered through the trees, bathing the pasture in a soft, calming warmth. The danger had passed, but the questions lingered. Dean and Baxter stood side by side, the bond between them stronger than ever. Yet, for all that they had been through, a sense of mystery remained, an unanswered question about what they had truly faced. For days after the battle, Dean couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness they had fought wasn't something that could simply be vanquished. The creature, the figure that had commanded the wolves, wasn't just a manifestation of evil. It was a force of nature, something ancient tied to the land itself. Something had awakened. But what? Dean's thoughts returned to the creatures that had attacked. The wolves. They weren't ordinary animals. There had been something about them, something different. They had moved with a collective intelligence, as if they were being guided by something beyond their natural instincts. And that figure, the dark entity, had been their leader. It had known them, controlled them. It wasn't just a predator, it was a puppeteer. But there was one question that nagged at Dean, the one he couldn't yet answer. Where did it come from? Dean and Baxter spent days combing the ranch, looking for any sign of the creature's return. But as time passed, the land began to settle. The once unsettling sense of presence seemed to fade. The wolves did not return. The dark figure did not resurface. The world returned to its natural rhythm, but Dean couldn't quite let go of the mystery. He couldn't ignore the unsettling truth that something ancient had stirred beneath their feet, and whatever it wasn't finished. One evening, after a long day of work, Dean sat on the porch, looking out over the land. His thoughts were distant when a sudden memory hit him. His father, a man who had spent his life on this land, had once told him stories as a child. Stories of the Earth's hidden secrets, of powers and forces that predated mankind. He had always thought they were just legends, folklore passed down through the generations. But now, standing on this land, this sacred ground, he began to wonder if there was more truth to those stories than he had ever imagined. Dean got up slowly, his eyes drifting over the ranch. Baxter stood beside him, ever watchful. Dean felt the weight of the years of work and tradition in his bones, the legacy of his family that had lived and fought on this land for generations. His father had been a protector, too. Maybe that's what he had been preparing him for all along, preparing him for a time when the land would call upon him to defend it from forces greater than anything he could understand. And perhaps it wasn't just about the land. Dean never expected to learn the full truth about the dark figure that had come to claim the land. But after weeks of research, he found something. It wasn't much at first, just an old journal tucked away in his father's study. The leather-bound book had been buried beneath a pile of old maps and papers, forgotten until now. Opening the journal, Dean discovered that his father, too, had encountered strange forces on the land. But what stood out to him was one particular entry, written in his father's careful script. The land is ancient. Before the settlers arrived, the earth here was already old, older than we can comprehend. The native tribes spoke of a dark force, one that lived deep within the earth, beneath the mountains and hills. It was a spirit of the land, neither good nor evil, but a protector until it was disturbed. The settlers came and took what they wanted, not knowing that by doing so, they unleashed something that had been bound for centuries. Dean's hands shook as he read the words. The creature he had encountered wasn't a spirit in the traditional sense. It wasn't merely a ghost or a demon. It was an earth spirit, a force that had existed long before human civilization took root on the land. It had been bound beneath the earth, imprisoned by the native tribes, whose ancestors had understood the delicate balance of nature. But the settlers, in their quest for land and wealth, had unknowingly disturbed that balance, awakening the force that had been trapped. What Dean had encountered wasn't just an evil entity. It was a force of nature, a primal power tied to the very fabric of the earth. And its release had been a mistake that had triggered a battle for dominance. The wolves, in turn, were not just wild animals. They were the natural guardians of the earth, beings connected to this ancient force. They had been summoned to protect the land, but something had gone wrong. They had been controlled, manipulated by the dark entity, and used as weapons. It wasn't until Baxter had fought the creature that the wolves had returned to their natural state, no longer under the creature's command. Dean understood now. The creature had been manipulating the natural order, using the wolves as instruments in its struggle to reclaim what it believed was rightfully its own, the land and the power within it. But that wasn't the end. The figure was still connected to the earth, still a part of the very land Dean called home. And as long as that power existed, it would be a threat, waiting, watching, and waiting for another opportunity to rise. Dean couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. It wasn't just a fight against one dark entity. It was a fight for the balance of the land. The dark force that had taken control was still tied to the earth itself. And as long as it was free, it could come back. And with it, new threats would emerge, each more dangerous than the last. But he also understood something else. He was the guardian of the land now. His father had passed the mantle to him, not just as a rancher, but as a protector. He and Baxter were more than just man and dog. They were keepers of the earth, defenders of the balance between the natural and the supernatural. Dean had learned that sometimes the greatest threats come from within the land itself. The creatures of legend were not myths. They were a part of the earth's history, beings tied to forces far older than mankind's understanding. And they would always be watching, waiting for an opportunity to rise again. But Dean knew that he wasn't alone. Baxter, his faithful companion, had proven time and again that loyalty and strength could stand against even the darkest of forces. Together, they would protect the ranch. They would keep the balance intact. And they would be ready for whatever came next. For now, the land was at peace. But Dean knew that peace was a fleeting thing. In this world, darkness would always seek to reclaim what it once had. But as long as he stood on the land, his land, he would fight to keep it. And Baxter, always by his side, would be there too,